Hello, subscribers! Welcome to the final episode in my, I think it's 8-part series, going over the Apocrypha. And yes, I kind of ran out of Mega Man pictures to use as my background. I didn't actually run out, but I ran out of any ones worth putting as a background. And it's not important enough to go look for a new one. Anyway, for anyone just tuning in these episodes, I am reading the Apocrypha for the first time and recording my reaction to them, and trying to determine if any of them belong in canon or not. So far, it's been not the whole way. And at the end of this video, I will try to briefly go over everything that I've covered throughout the series. To start, we're going over the Prayer of Manasseh, and the program I have has two prayers of Manasseh. And so far, just briefly glancing at the beginning of them, the only difference I can see is verse 1. This one has the Prayer of Manasseh, the Prayer of Manasseh's King of Judah, and then the other one just goes straight into what the other one had as verse 2. So I don't know how or why that is, but they seem like they're going to be identical. But let's see what they say. Okay, I've read through them both. Not much to say about them except that they are both identical. The only difference is that first verse that just introduces it. But I do want to check to see if I can find this in the Old Testament. I don't know that I will, even if I knew where to find it. But if I did manage to find it in the Old Testament, that would really make me question why this even exists. Okay, the prayer itself is not in the Old Testament, but it is consistent, specifically with Chronicles. I've already forgotten whether it was 1st or 2nd Chronicles. I wasn't paying that close attention to it. But the Chronicles version of how Manasseh's life went gets more specific. If you only read Kings, you would assume that this is not canon because it doesn't say anything about him repenting. But Chronicles goes a little more in depth. So, story-wise, it is perfectly consistent, so whether or not it's canon will depend on other things. And just to remind ourselves, these are the books that Catholics consider canon, and Prayer of Manasseh is not on here. Also, I might as well mention this now since it's on the screen. Daniel and Esther, apparently in the Catholic books canon, have extra parts to them. That is not something I can go over in this series, as I don't have it here in the Apocrypha, and I won't know which parts have been added, or if they're added in this particular version. Yeah, according to my phone, Daniel has 12 chapters, so I don't think this includes the extended version of Daniel. So that's just not something I'm going to be able to go over. That will just remain a mystery to me. So it's safe to assume that this entire video will cover books that are not canon, because even Catholics don't consider them canon. But I'm going to go over them anyway. Next up, I had it all set, and then it just went back to that. All right, next up, Susanna. And right away, this is another book happening within Babylon. That seems to be a running theme of the Apocrypha. A large percentage of the Apocrypha were allegedly written during Babylon, or at least about Babylon. Okay, so the story is of these two guys who want to rape this beautiful woman, but she refuses, so they try to not violently rape, but blackmail rape. And when she refuses, they witness against her so that she would be executed. And verse 45, therefore, when she was led to be put to death, the Lord raised up the Holy Spirit of a young youth whose name was Daniel. Is this supposed to be the same Daniel? Or is this just coincidentally somebody named Daniel? It sounds like it could be, but at the same time, something about it feels off. Like, there's something I can't put my finger on that just doesn't sound like a historical retelling. Like, it doesn't sound like hey, here's this thing that happened. It sounds, hey, here's this story. I hope that makes sense. Okay, here's something I can put my finger on. So this Daniel tricks the two false witnesses into proving that they're false by asking what tree did they witness the event happen under. Now, there are so many options here. Like, obviously, they just outright said two different trees. That's how they got caught and they got executed. But no tree is an option. And also, how many different types of trees were in the garden? It seems very plausible they could have easily said the same tree just by accident. The narrative doesn't tell us anything about the trees or how likely it was that they would say the same tree or a different tree, and it didn't even have to happen under a tree. So the whole narrative itself feels staged. And really, even if this was a real account, I don't see much reason for it to be canon, but I just don't believe for a second that this is a real event that happened anyway. Okay, no, dang it. So next we move on to Bell and Dragon, which actually sounds like an anime title. Let's see what this is about. So again, this feels like just a story. It does not have that tinge of historicity, whatever you want to call it. And so Bel and Dragon are two false gods that allegedly were worshipped by Cyrus. And he keeps asking Daniel, well, if these are false gods, how do they eat? Because he places the food out and the food disappears. And Daniel is just one by one disproving them. He proved that Bel had a secret compartment that the priests are eating the food in or something. I got a little lost in the narrative of who was where at what time and whatnot. And then 26, but give me, talking about dragon, give me leave, O king, and I shall slay this dragon without sword or staff. That feels very just mythical storytelling. I can't think of the proper word for it, but so far it just does not feel at all historical. Okay, this part's very suspicious. The priests are plotting against the king, not Daniel. So they came to the king and said, deliver us, Daniel, or else we will destroy thee and thine house. Who are the priests to make such a threat? There ain't no way that actually happened. And now it's telling us this is when Daniel was thrown into the lion's den? I'm going to have to refresh my memory on that. Hang on. Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. This is not why Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. And it also wasn't under Cyrus. It was Darius who threw Daniel into the lion's den. And it was because Daniel disobeyed a specific decree. Not because the king was threatened in any way. So, in addition to clearly being fiction, this is also contradicting scripture. Don't really need to say any more about it, but I'm gonna finish. Okay, so this prophet Habakkuk, I don't know if this is referring to a real Habakkuk. Pretty sure there's a book Habakkuk, but it doesn't matter. So it sounds like the angel is telling Habakkuk to bring food to Daniel, presumably, because I stopped reading to make this comment, presumably so that the lions would have something else to eat instead, which again would contradict scripture. But I had to mention this because, hang on, then the angel of the Lord took him by the crown and bare him by the hair of his head, and through the vehemency of his spirit to set him in Babylon over the den. Just picked him up by his hair and dragged him to Babylon. This book is just silly. Okay, the food actually was for Daniel, even though Daniel only spent one night in there. He did not need food. I don't know what the writer was thinking with this one. This is one of the easiest examples of not canon that I have read in this entire series. So the last book is Azariah. Okay, let's see what this one says. And here we have another book that starts out in mid-sentence. And they walked in the midst of the fire, praising God and blessing the Lord. Who is the they that we're talking about? It just starts mid-sentence. Alright, that was a boring, pretty much anticlimactic way to end this series. This is basically similar to Prayer of Manasseh, except it feels less historical, I guess. From what I gather, it sounds like it's supposedly written by one of the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because it clearly talks about the furnace, but the names aren't exactly right. Ananias, Azarias, and Mishael. I'm too lazy to go check and find out what their Hebrew names were, but I don't think those were it. Misael, maybe, I don't know. The only thing that strikes me that it could possibly conflict with actual scripture is the names, and that is, names have a high likelihood of being messed up anyway, as we have seen previously in this series. But I'm going to just, call it good, because we have the list of Deuterocanon that Catholics accept, and none of the books covered in this video are on there, so it's not something I don't even want to research these. It feels like there's nothing to research. Certainly nobody's going to make arguments for them to be in canon because they're not accepted as canon. So really the only thing I would be researching is to try and figure out why there's two prayers of Manasseh. And I'll just do that after the video. It's not important. I do not care. It's just curiosity. So, overview of what we've gone through. Esdras, first and second. Esdras was mostly, a large chunk of Esdras was literally just repeating stuff said in Ezra and Chronicles, and it claims to be written by the prophet Esdras/Ezra, but we know from reading Ezra that Ezra was not a prophet. He was a scribe and a priest, not a prophet. And Esdras 2 just goes right off the rails. It repeats a lot of stuff from Esdras 1, stuff that was not the repeats of Ezra and Chronicles, and just gives prophecies in ways that prophecies are not given, like way too much detail. Eagle with 12 wings and 12 feathers on each of the wings, and each of the feathers mean this. It was just too much. Not to mention that stupid Esdras complaining about the woman who turned out to be Judah because she was grieving her son. That was so stupid. Just go to my video on it for more details, and that goes with all of these. Just go to my videos for more details. Tobit was a clearly fictitious story about a man who... This is something I didn't think about the first time I read it, but when the sparrow poops in his eye and he's blinded, somehow, it's clear that somehow he managed to get poop in both of his eyes, not just one. That is also stretching credibility. But yeah, there's multiple reasons why Tobit is recognized as a work of fiction, and again, I'm pretty sure even Catholic Church recognizes it as fiction, but it does not present itself as fiction, which is an easy way to tell that it's not canon, regardless of any historical reasons out there. Judith, same issue. The Catholic Church itself does not recognize this as actual history, but it presents itself as actual history. Therefore, it is lying to us, and therefore not canon. Don't need to go into any more detail. Wisdom. I hated Wisdom. Just the way it was written made it very difficult to read. And I can't remember everything I said on it. You will have to go watch the video. It pretty much makes Wisdom, it deifies Wisdom, makes it a part of the Godhead, which is obviously a strong reason not to include it in canon. Sirach was the first good book I read, and the first book I can actually recommend reading. Right? I'm not confusing it with something else. Yeah. It is not historical, right? I mean, it's not presented as history. It's presented as wisdom. A book which was translated by the grandson of Jesus, the son of Sirach, I think. Or maybe Jesus, son of Sirach, was the translator, and Sirach was the person who wrote it. I can't be sure. And I don't remember all the problems that were with it. I think there were some, but I think the main issue was that it does not have the original Hebrew. We only have it in Greek, and then translated from Greek, obviously. So there's a lot of good stuff in here, but not much reason to consider it canon. Epistle of Jeremiah and Baruch, most likely not written by the actual Jeremiah and Baruch. And if that is indeed the case, they are definitely not canon. If, however, they were written by Baruch and Jeremiah, respectively, it's still doubtful that they would be canon, but it makes for a much stronger argument. But unless somebody can prove that they were actually written by who they claim to be written by, I'm just not going to count them. Maccabees. First Maccabees has the strongest argument out of the two Maccabees for consideration into canon. It is actual history. I recommend reading it, but it does not feel like God-written history. It feels like history as written by man, because it is very man-oriented. And I don't mean in the manly way that Second Maccabees does. Second Maccabees has its own problems. That one is less likely to be canon, as it is very mythical. Having angels appear like every few years. May not even be years. I have no idea the timing of it, but they were showing up way too often when there was no prophet who could actually see them. You go into the Old Testament, look at Elijah and or Elisha, and they could see the angels and no one else could. So if angels help out in a battle, most likely you will not see them. It takes a prophet to see them, which this is way late for me to say, but this is why I made that big deal of you needing a prophet. Within Second Maccabees, you need a prophet to be able to write about all this stuff, because it's the prophets who would be able to see the angels. I wish I had mentioned that in my Maccabees video, but I just could not find the words. And then the rest is just what I've already gone over in this video. So, final conclusion. Surprise, surprise. The Protestants are correct. Catholics are wrong. All the Apocrypha do not belong in canon. And only a couple of them I can actually recommend reading. Like, maybe I can recommend the Epistle of Jeremiah, because it's consistent in a way. Like, it's consistent in that everything it says is true, in terms of facts, not in terms of history, if that's a proper way to say it. But it may not be consistent with the way Jeremiah spoke to the people. Like, a lot of what you got at the end of Jeremiah was doomsaying. And then Epistle of Jeremiah is uplifting. Don't trust these false gods. And here's how you can tell they're false gods. It doesn't quite match his writing personality. So I can half recommend Epistle of Jeremiah. And I can recommend Sirach. And I can recommend First Maccabees. And that's it. Everything else can be tossed. I will never recommend something that is something like Judas, which is obviously false, not actual history, but presents itself as history. That's just lying to the audience. And I will never recommend something that is so obviously lying to the audience. Anyway, that's it for this series. See you in whatever video I decide to make next. Hold on there, not so fast. There has been a change in plans. So I was mostly finished editing the video and working on the comments I would write, because I did some post-video research. And I didn't think anything would come up that would be important enough to put in the video, so I was just going to write them in the comments. But that turned out not to be the case. It turns out that the app I use does have the Catholic Bible. I was just too lazy to go look for it. So I do have the extended versions of Daniel and Esther. For Daniel, it's an extra 2 chapters, and we've already gone over them. Chapter 13 is actually Susanna, and chapter 14 is actually Bell and Dragon. So I've already covered that those 2 additions are not canon. Chapter 13, aka Susanna, just doesn't read like the rest of Daniel, and speaks of Daniel assuming it's the same Daniel, which we can only make that assumption because it's allegedly in the book of Daniel. But nowhere in this chapter does it, on its own, assume that it's the same Daniel, or give us reason to believe that. We get no genealogy. So it just doesn't feel right. And although I haven't seen any arguments either for or against these 2 chapters being in canon, because again, as usual, the Catholic arguments are mostly focused around either the Church Fathers accepted them or the Protestants have bad reasons to deny them, which is simply not the case. We got some pretty good reasons. Though I will later have to probably try and look more into Daniel 13, aka Susanna, but I'm doubtful, highly doubtful, that there is any credence to it being canon. And 14/Bell and Dragon, absolutely not canon. I don't even need to research that one. It flatly contradicts Daniel. So, it absolutely does not belong. But the real interesting part, which is what forced me to come back and do another recording, is the changes in Esther. Esther is the same amount of chapters. So the additions to Esther are additional verses within the chapters, which makes it really hard to find them at a glance. But the difference is the additions make a huge difference. First of all, these additions were made in the time of the Maccabees. In fact, I'll go ahead and read it here, which, when I first looked at this, I thought this was the only addition, and then I went and researched it and found out there's just additions all over the book. So here's at the end of the Catholic version of Esther. So they will observe these days in the month of Adar on the 14th and 15th of that month, with an assembly and joy and gladness before God, from generation to generation, forever among his people of Israel. Postscript 11. In the 4th year of the reign of Ptolemy and Cleopatra, Dositheus, who said that he was a priest and a Levite, and his son Ptolemy, brought to Egypt the preceding letter about Purim, which they said was authentic and had been translated by Lysimachus, son of Ptolemy, one of the residents of Jerusalem. So all these additions came from this letter that was brought, letter about Purim. I saw Purim somewhere. I forget who or what Purim was, even though I literally just read it not too long ago. But basically Esther. So Dositheus brought this letter, which was allegedly originally part of Esther, but we didn't discover it until the time of the Maccabees. And these additions make a huge difference because the Esther without the additions do not mention God at all. And these additions mention God quite a bit. And even have Mordecai having a vision/dream about the upcoming events. Now, I hate this. Every time I try to switch, it stays on the chapter I was on. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and find all the differences, all these moments, which means I'm going to have to read through all of Esther and try to determine how plausible this all is within the context of the story. It does seem a little sus that all these additions came in the way that they came, when they came, but if they were true, then it would be a type of preservation, so it should be worth looking into. However, there is something to be said about Esther not mentioning God that could actually be an important narrative aspect of Esther, given the time in which Esther took place. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is after the prophets, so there would have been no prophets at this time anymore. Or at least none of the prophets we have writing of. In my research, apparently Shameless Popery makes the argument that there were prophets in the time when there was no prophets. The 200 to 400 years of silence. I don't really want to get into all that. I don't think it changes anything I've said throughout this series, because even if prophets were around during that period, we don't have any of their writings. Certainly nothing that can be unequivocally described as writings of prophets. Esdras was not a prophet because he claimed it. There's a claim there that Esdras is Ezra, and we know Ezra is not a prophet, or was not a prophet. Second Maccabees, most likely written by Jason of Cyrene. I don't think anybody claims Jason of Cyrene as a prophet, though I also don't know if it was Jason of Cyrene that added all the angels in there, or if those were flourishes brought on by the person trying to abridge Jason of Cyrene. But as far as I know, we don't know who that person is, so not a prophet. At least not a confirmed prophet anyway. Epistle of Jeremiah, if it were actually written by Jeremiah, which I don't have good reason to really think it was, that would be the only one that was written by a prophet. Anyway, enough about prophets. I have forgotten how that line of thought started. So I'm going to read through Esther, try to figure out if it matches, if it's consistent with Scripture, and yeah, I'll just see where I go from here. Alright, so the first edition is just the first verse. So the first thing that jumps out at me is talking about Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, had a dream. He was a Jew living in the city of Susa, a great man, serving in the court of the king. Okay. He was one of the captives whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had brought from Jerusalem, with King Jeconiah of Judah. That is suspicious, because Mordecai was serving the king of the Medes and the Persians. He definitely wasn't serving Nebuchadnezzar or any of the kings of Babylon. Babylon had fallen by the time Esther came about. Problem is, I don't actually know the full timing of all this. I don't know how many generations down the king Artaxerxes is, who Esther marries. Will wonders never cease? I actually went to Google. Well, not Google, but anyway. This is what the AI came up with, and I'm taking it with a grain of salt, but I'll just look at the dates. So we have the fall of Babylon in 539 BC, and Esther starting at the earliest, that's a high earliest, because, well, I don't know. That wouldn't be when he was born. Yeah. But the earliest being 486. That's about 110 years. That would make Mordecai somewhere between 120 and 200 years old by the time the events in Esther takes place. So if this timeline is right, my instincts were correct. And this is very sus. Mordecai, unless Mordecai did live to 200, which is not impossible. Maybe it'll tell me later in Esther how long Mordecai lived. I don't remember it telling me, but it's been a while. But unless he was that old, he was not a captive of King Nebuchadnezzar. Because remember, I was just going by the fall of Babylon, not when Nebuchadnezzar actually would have taken him prisoner. So there's a bunch of years there I didn't even account for. Not off to a great start for these additions to Esther. I gotta say something about this dream. It mentions 2 dragons and the nations of the earth going against, it is, at their warring, every nation prepared for war to fight against the righteous nation. Tribulation, affliction, turmoil on the earth. And the whole righteous nation was troubled. That sounds, what's the word? A bit more abstract than these prophetic dreams are normally given. You look at the dreams that Daniel got and Joseph, Nebuchadnezzar, and the Pharaoh, respectively. Like, you had the skinny cows eating the fat cows. It didn't assign any meaning to the cows until the dream was interpreted. Like, they weren't called the evil cows and the righteous cows, which that's obviously not even the interpretation, but I'm hoping you get my point. Like, how can you tell within the dream, before you've received an interpretation, that this nation was righteous? Dreams will typically be more solidified in their description. So like the nation would be something like prosperous. Because prosperous is something you can see at a glance. Green fields, high walls, whatever. But a righteous nation, that's not something you can see. That is an interpretation, which you would not get from the dream itself. So this does not sound like a biblical dream, a biblical prophetic dream. Okay. And Mordecai interprets his own dream, which, fair enough, he's an old man, but how does he interpret that as a plot against the king? I would have interpreted righteous nation as Jerusalem. That's where I thought this was going. The Mede and Persian Empire, that is not a righteous nation. Still not looking good for the Esther editions. It's kind of funny that somehow I memorized the name of this king as either Xerxes or Artaxerxes. I could never keep them straight. But apparently most Bible translations, or most that I would read, are Ahasuerus. I mean, clearly I can't pronounce that name anyway, so I'd much rather say Xerxes, but still feels odd that I would never have really noticed that. Maybe it's a good thing I'm reading Esther again. So I just noticed something I've never really noticed before about why Queen Vashti did not obey the king's orders. Verse 8, drinking was by flagons without restraint, for the king had given orders to all the officials of his palace to do as each one desired. Furthermore, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the palace of the king. In King James Version, which is on my phone, and the drinking was according to the law, none did compel, for so the king had appointed to all the officers of his house, that they should do according to every man's pleasure. So the queen was basically being obedient to the earlier command to do as she desired. The earlier command, most likely not one of those unchanging laws that the king cannot change, but neither would his command for the queen to come before him have been. I imagine she was quite upset and probably assumed the king a hypocrite or something, to find that she could not do as she pleased as the king had given orders for. But I'm not trying to do Bible study on Esther. I just had to mention that. Chapter 2, verse 5 says verse 6 actually, says it was Kish who had been carried away in Jerusalem, which is Mordecai's great-grandfather. That would make more sense. Let's see if that, matches here. He was really it doesn't work though. Not the way this is written. Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, had a dream. So there's no way to connect it to Kish. Once you say had a dream, you're talking about Mordecai again. So then you say he was the Jew living in the city of Susa, a great man serving the court of the king. He was one of the captives from King Nebuchadnezzar. That is undeniably speaking about Mordecai. There's no way to read that as speaking about Kish. And it's Kish who was captured and brought to Babylon. So yeah, if you use the Catholic version of Esther, then Esther contradicts itself. Now, here's another thing that might be an inconsistency. We know later in Esther, Mordecai overhears the plot to kill the king, with no mention of a dream, but that's not what we're talking about right now. But then it's recorded, and nothing is done for Mordecai. This is an important part of the story, that Mordecai does not gain any prize or reward for this, for saving the king's life. But going back to this edition, where was it? Mordecai counted them, and the king ordered Mordecai to serve in the court, and rewarded him for these things. I may have jumped the gun there, because this could be one of those situations where in one chapter it's looking at the broad picture, broad strokes, and then at another chapter it's looking at the finer details. The problem is, this additional account would be the one looking at the finer details, because it's trying to explain the specifics of how Mordecai overheard the conversation and found out about the plot. Whereas in chapter 2, he was just sitting at the king's gate and overheard them. And that was it. But then why would the verse that gives more detail also give extra detail, which would be consistent with a more broad strokes type of thing. I really keep coming back to this first edition quite a bit. I haven't even found the second edition yet. But yeah, that difference between specific and broad strokes description of events really does make this feel like they were written by two completely different people, which is not good for the argument for it being in canon. Okay, this is something annoying that I don't know whether it's specific to the Catholic Bible or specific to the app. It obviously has nothing to do with the point of this video, but the editions aren't even their own verses. Like, the edition B just places itself within verse 13. I mean, I guess that kind of makes sense, but couldn't you just do 13.5? So this edition is allegedly a copy of the letter that the king sent out. And suspiciously, it does not mention the Jews by name. It just says certain people. And therefore we have decreed that those indicated to you in the letters written by Haman. So that's the only way they know how these people are. Why are they not indicated in this law/letter? Because I assume that Haman wrote this, if this is real. I would not assume the king wrote this himself. He just signed off on it without reading it. This is especially obvious when you look here. When I asked my counselors how this might be accomplished, Haman, who excels among us in sound judgment and is distinguished for his unchanging goodwill and steadfast fidelity, and has attained the second place in the kingdom, this was clearly written by Haman, if it's authentic. But other than what I've already mentioned, I don't think I'm going to be coming back to this one like I did in Exhibit A, Edition A. This one seems as consistent as you could be while not mentioning the Jews by name. Oh, I don't believe this. Okay, first of all, Esther 5 has got a lot of additions into it. And the first part, up until it says Esther's prayer, seems consistent. It's just a prayer from Mordecai. Nothing seems off about it. But Esther's prayer. Then Queen Esther, seized with deadly anxiety, fled to the Lord. She took off her splendid apparel and put on the garments of distress and mourning, and instead of costly perfumes, she covered her head with ashes and dung, and she utterly humbled her body. What? Why? No. No one has ever humbled themselves by purposely covering themselves in dung. And being humble is one thing, but she is preparing to present herself to the king uninvited. There's no way she would have done that. That's like testing God right there. Every part that she loved to adorn, she covered with her tangled hair. That is suspiciously specific or descriptive. Like how long was her hair that she could just cover every part that she would adorn? And now she's praying, and it makes me wonder who wrote this. I don't want to wonder that too much, because you could wonder about that for a lot of places. But I'm already on a high alert for suspicious activity. I have to stop reading and go over this. The prayer, something's off about it. Like, she's very prophetic in her prayer. Like, remind me if I'm forgetting something in the Old Testament when people prayed for victory or whatever they prayed for. They didn't pray that specifically. And I can't think of any examples of any prayers that I could work with this, but like Moses didn't pray that the Egyptians would be drowned in the Red Sea. He just did it because that's what he was supposed to do. If he did pray for something that specific, it was not recorded for us. Now, a prophet could do something like that, pray for something specific and have it come to pass. But I'm talking about people who are not prophets, which Esther is not a prophet. Moses is a prophet, but then that goes against what I just said, but just ignore that. This was just an example. So this prayer ends up becoming foreshadowing to the rest of the book. And then after it's done with her prayer, it starts. At this part, it's very detailed. Then majestically adorned, after invoking the aid God, she stood before the king. He was seated on his royal throne, clothed in full array of his majesty, all covered with gold and precious stones. He was most terrifying. It's very detail-oriented, more so than you would expect. But also this edition doesn't seem properly put in. It's chapter 5, and I don't know where verse 2 is. It's hard to see here. Well, there is no verse 2. It's all verse 1, yet for some reason, it goes to verse 3. Now this might be an issue with the program, but chapter 5 in King James starts out with, "Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel." That is similar to what I was reading here, but it's clearly an addition. This is still in the addition part. And when it's not, and the addition is ended, it says, "The king said to her, 'What is it, Queen Esther?'" Which is verse 3 of King James. Alright, this sounds very unlikely. Esther faints, and the king rushes to her and says, "What is it, Esther? I am your husband, take courage." That just seems out of character. Yes, I accept that he cares for her, but that phrase, "I am your husband, take courage." So yeah, this is more than just an addition. This is a replacement. They are replacing verse 2. Verse 2 should say, "And it was so when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter." That is completely different to what we get here, and it's missing. According to this, he raised the golden scepter and touches her neck with it. Yeah, this does not jive. This is clearly fan fiction. Alright. Here's another suspicious part in chapter 8. This is allegedly a copy of the letter Mordecai wrote to allow the Jews to defend themselves. And although Mordecai wrote it, he was writing it on behalf of the king. So people should be thinking about this in the king's voice. But pretty sure the king, at least at this point, was not worshiping the same God. And thinking this, they even assume that they will escape the evil-hating justice of God. Capital G, could that maybe be Yahweh? It doesn't say Lord, so maybe it doesn't mean Yahweh specifically. But over here now, for Haman son of Hanathana, a Macedonian, parentheses, really an alien to the Persian blood, and quite devoid of our kindliness. That doesn't sound proper, but maybe that's just me. Okay, what's going on here? But unable to restrain his arrogance, he undertook to deprive us of our kingdom and our life, and with intricate craft and deceit asked for the destruction of Mordecai, our savior and perpetual benefactor, and of Esther, the blameless partner of our kingdom, together with their whole nation. It's not as obvious as what Haman did, allegedly, in his letter, but would Mordecai really puff himself up like this? Okay, no. Again, yes, Mordecai is writing this, but he's writing it on behalf of the king. And the king would not say this, but are governed by, speaking of the Jews, righteous laws, and are children of the living God, most high, most mighty, who has directed the kingdom both for us and for our ancestors in the most excellent order. If the king does not worship the Most High God, it is dishonest to put words in his mouth like this. These specific words. And another thing. Now, I may have missed it. "You will therefore do well not to put in execution the letter sent by Haman. Therefore post a copy of this letter publicly in every place. Permit the Jews to live under their own laws, and give them reinforcements so that on the 13th day of the 12th month they may defend themselves, those who attack them at the time of oppression. The initial edict was sent out to everybody, an edict that cannot be undone, which is why this letter had to just allow the Jews to defend themselves. And while this doesn't sound like a strict command to not attack them, it's also saying give them reinforcements, which kind of hard to attack them while reinforcing them. Yeah, that whole letter is just very suspicious. Clearly it was written by a Jew, but I don't think it's Mordecai. I think Mordecai would have been more honest and careful with his words, because there's no way Xerxes was worshiping God at this point. Even if he did later on, he certainly wasn't doing it now, which I'm not sure he ever did, but he was married to Esther, so don't want to completely discount the possibility. I will say this about the letter. It is maybe somewhat consistent with the people fearing the Jews and a lot of them becoming Jews because of that, but still sounds suspect. Here's something I didn't bother looking at earlier. Earlier in that letter, it called Haman a Macedonian, but Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite. Now, I don't know. I don't know enough about geography and the political structure, so maybe it's possible an Agagite is a Macedonian, but I'm just putting it out there. I don't know. If it's not, that's a clear contradiction. And here's that word Purim I mentioned earlier. Therefore, these days are called Purim for the word pure and all that. I don't remember when I mentioned that. I know it was earlier in this recording, way early, and that I mentioned not remembering where I saw it. Well, here's one place at least. So after reading that, specifically that first edition, again, I'm coming back to that. That first edition to Esther is the most conflicting, just worst edition, because back in Esther 10, Mordecai speaking, and he, what's the word? He interprets the dream that the two dragons were Haman and Mordecai, and the nations are those that gather to destroy the name of the Jews. But he already gave the interpretation, or the main interpretation given in that first edition was that the king was about to be assassinated. And I don't think he fully interpreted the dream in chapter 10 either, but okay. This is just an annoying the way it's written, because they decided not to put chapter breaks in the editions. I read a plot against the king as the interpretation because of how it came out. And after you had it in mind, seeking all day to understand in every detail. Against the king. It sounded like that's what the interpretation was. Well, I'm glad I at least noticed it at the end here. That would have been embarrassing to post this and not realize that. And no, I'm not going to do a re-record because this is a live-ish reaction. Nevertheless, though, this was not a full interpretation. He did not interpret the earthquakes. I hate having to constantly go back, especially with the way this thing works. The noises and confusion, not interpreted. Thunders and earthquake, not interpreted. Tumult on the earth, not interpreted. Two great dragons. He interpreted that as him and Haman, both ready to fight, which, I guess, they warred terribly. Haman warred terribly. Sure, whatever. And they're warring, every nation prepared for war. Sure. To fight against the righteous. Now, hang on. I don't, this makes it sound like both the dragons are against the righteous nation. Day of darkness and gloom, tribulation and distress, affliction, great turmoil on the earth. Not interpreted. I mean, it's obvious, but if you're going to have a prophetic dream, you have to fully interpret it. All other prophetic dreams recorded in the Bible are fully interpreted. We don't have a passage saying, and Daniel interpreted his dream, and then it just gives us nothing about the interpretation. So anyway, that's the additions to Esther. I think it's pretty safe to say they are not to be trusted. There is some consistency, but there is also some clear contradictions, like with Esther going to meet the king and fainting. That fainting passage is the clearest example of why all these editions just should not be trusted. So, the extended versions of Esther and Daniel are not canon, and since I'm here, I might as well read the comment I had originally thought to write. After some mild research into the prayer of Manasseh, I discovered that I missed where it claimed that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did not sin. That is a clear contradiction with actual scripture. Also, it seems to be attributed to being written in the 2nd century, the final nail in its coffin. I still don't have any idea why my app has 2 versions, or why they only have 1 or 2 verses. Something I didn't even notice when reading them. But I don't care enough to try any harder to find out. Catholics don't accept prayer of Manasseh, so there's no point in concerning myself anymore with it. Alright, that's it for real this time. See you in the next video.